are muted for the time being. If at some point in the discussion you'd like to ask a question, please put that question down in the Q&A. We will notice it and we will take you off of mute so that you can ask that question to our panelists. The chat is also available for you for the entire conversation. Okay, so this is a 3-panel series, Engineering Solutions for the Next Pandemic, Exploring Ethics Concerns. It is a project of the Online Ethics Center, OEC, which is a project of the National Academies of Engineering and funded by the National Science Foundation. This particular series is in partnership with 2 other organizations, the ASEE Engineering Ethics Division and the APPE, Association for Practical and Professional Ethics. We are, the 3 of us, working on this series together. Today is the first of the panel series. And so now, if you'll give me a moment to come off of my share, what I'd like to do is just give you a little background before introducing the panelists. So it was with the demands of the Civil War, which broke out in 1861, that the government's urgent need for independent advising on science matters came to the fore. And to meet that need, President Lincoln signed a congressional charter forming the National Academy of Sciences in 1863. And under the same charter, eventually included the National Academy of Engineering and of Medicine. Today, our panel is asking, in fact, the series is asking, what is the role of engineers, particularly today, in helping our nation to address its most current urgencies? The coronavirus being the focus of this particular panel discussion. Of course, since we formed this, this project for the summer, other matters of urgency have come to the fore for our nation, all of which could use the help of the great problem solvers, the engineers. So we'd like to ask today, is it important to adhere to established ethics guidelines as engineers come to the fore to address some of these issues and to advise and guide the nation? Codes of engineering for research and development in this era of the pandemic, do those need to be changed, altered, looked at differently because of the crisis that we're in? What engineering standards still apply? And since another pandemic is likely in the future, how might crisis standards of ethics help us to prepare for that future? What should or should not engineers be doing? How ought engineering education be responding at this time? So discuss this and other questions. I'm welcoming our 4 panelists. Thank you so much. And in alphabetical order, we'll start with Dr. Jonathan Bieber, Assistant Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture in the Department of Philosophy and the Text and Technology PhD program at the University of Central Florida. Jonathan is co-founder and director of the UCF Center for Ethics. Thank you for being here. And we have Angela Bielefeld, please correct me. Bielefeld, he's a licensed professional engineer and has taught civil and environmental engineering courses at the University of Colorado since 1996. Dr. Bielefeld's research ethics include engineering education, ethics in engineering education. Thank you for being here. Dr. Steve Secchio, Vincent T. and Gloria M. Garuzzi, Professor of Engineering, Professor of Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering, Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Applied Mechanics, Associate Dean for Research, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Thank you for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Carolyn Compton, who's professor at Arizona State University and Mayo Clinic Chief Medical Officer of National Biomarkers Development Alliance and Complex Adaptive Systems Institute. If you all are comfortable, I would like to refer to you on a first name basis just for the informality of our conversation. And let's leave the ethicist to speak last and start with the person that's, let's start with Dr. Secchio, Stephen, and then we'll go to Angela, who's also an ethicist, thank you, Carolyn, and then Jonathan. Opening statements, please.
Sure, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn from both the panelists and hopefully from the discussion we have with the audience. as the research dean, usually the operational tempo of the kind of decision making we have to make around ethical issues and compliance is not as fast as it has been in the coronavirus response at the University of Michigan. There's been a number of rapid responses that we've had to make on the fly to try to solve the problems of our hospital and other stakeholders on campus. Thankfully, they've not really involved any ethical quandaries per se, but what it is it really does, it brings to the fore the questions that the committee that this panel has put together, which is that how do you balance the need for speed as well as the need for safety and ethical behavior? And so I hope to be able to contribute this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Angela, if you will.
Sure. Thanks. So I prepared a statement. I'll just read it because I wanted to make sure I wouldn't go over, because as an academic, I could talk a lot. So as an engineer, I don't think a lot about ethics from the perspective of theories such as deontology, which is most closely related to rules. If we want to consider these ethical perspectives, engineers have typically approached ethics from a consequentialist perspective, valuing the results of actions, or a utilitarian perspective which underlies benefit cost analysis. But that approach has many limitations. Best for whom? How to even quantify benefits and harms when these are experienced differently based on our values, culture, and other considerations. I personally have started thinking about ethics from a care perspective, which brings it very much down to the personal level. To assume that professionals have fully agreed upon rules of ethics is not the case. Setting aside these philosophical arguments, engineering ethics tends to be much more practical and focused on making ethical decisions, which means we need to think back to the history behind our regulations, FDA and otherwise. These rules and regulations were made under a particular set of circumstances, trying to draw an appropriate compromise among a complex array of factors, a benefit cost analysis to make a simplistic analogy. Our understanding of the science may have changed. Regulations are often driven by an array of additional factors, including economics and politics. It is highly likely that there was disagreement about these rules. It is simply that these debates have been lost to time. So while a rule may naively appear to reflect a consensus, it probably didn't. And while it may have been appropriate for the conditions when it was enacted, those conditions have probably changed due to technology, advances in science, and other shifts. During the COVID pandemic, the calculus behind these benefits and costs has now changed. So I would argue we are not trying to change our fundamental ethical beliefs. We still adhere to the foundational ethical charge for engineers to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public and strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development, in the words of the American Society of Civil Engineers Code of Ethics. However, it has never been obvious how best to accomplish this lofty goal, even in normal times. These ideas are not black and white. Safety is never yes or no, but rather a level of risk tolerance. Further, welfare is highly personal, beyond our numbers on a page and counting deaths, considering quality of life. And while it is certainly important to carefully weigh these ideas and debate the ethical ramifications of different scenarios, at the end of the day, one must act. Inaction is a choice with its own consequences. Civil engineers deal with uncertainty every day, designing resilient infrastructure like bridges and dams to face perils of nature ranging from earthquakes to hurricanes. I believe that our current situation demands us to be more transparent, to more clearly reveal the uncertainties that have always been part of our rules and decisions. Perhaps people have placed too much blind trust in science and engineering. The complexities of our world in the physical and natural sense are myriad and not fully understood. Add to that social issues, and one should not be surprised that many individuals, all trying to make the best decisions, arrive at different conclusions. Our regulations likely made some value judgments about best for whom that are not visible today. So this COVID situation might jar us from complacency and assuming that we can easily reduce our complexity to a single headline. Thanks.
Oh, goodness gracious. Thank you so much. And there's so much there to unpack and talk about. But what we will do as a panel is we'll have each person make an opening statement. explore, discuss a little bit, and then open it up to all who are with us. So Carolyn Compton is both a medical doctor and a PhD, so your perspective brings something even different to the table. Please share with us your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Roz. I admit up front, I am not an ethicist nor an engineer, but I have worked closely with both throughout my career. And I think I was invited to speak on this panel because I have two rather unique sets of background experiences. And one of them is with technology development. I headed up something called the IMAT program at the National Cancer Institute, which was innovative molecular assessment technologies for cancer and med technology developers, inventors. And I second the statement that most engineers are not thinking about ethics. In fact, it's kind of a challenge to get them to think about the ethics involved with the application of their technology. So I've had a little bit of experience talking about that, but mostly I'm a doc. I'm a physician, and right now I am running a high throughput coronavirus testing laboratory that is just a pop-up laboratory that has developed right out of an academic laboratory, gotten FDA's authorized use for emergency EUA use for our technologies, and gotten CLIA approval to test patients. And of course, I'm in Arizona, and the number of cases is going through the roof. So I'm thinking all the time about the butting heads of the two most important issues as I see them. One is that someone mentioned that the need for speed, but I am running a laboratory. I'm a pathologist, and I have as my mandate professionally, legally, and ethically to get the right answer from the right test to the right patient in time to help them. And that's a very complex task. Complex technologies that we are using in the laboratory right now are inherently characterized by uncertainty, and they are being applied to a biologic situation, which is in fact defined as a complex adaptive system, a complex disease on a complex organism like human beings. And complex adaptive systems are by definition unpredictable. So you are using an unpredictable system to make a diagnosis about an unpredictable disease about which we know very little right now, on an unpredictable organism, and we have no idea right now what the factors related to the host bring to the table in terms of this disease. So I'm in the midst of putting together what I need to do medically, what I need to do ethically, and what I need to do technically. And here's my opening statement. I believe that adhering to ethical standards is more important now than ever. Just because we can do something technologically, we can engineer a new solution, doesn't mean we should be using it, because in fact, getting the wrong answer faster is not going to help our patients. So we have to be absolutely certain that we are weighing the risk benefit, that we know what the risk benefit is, and skipping over steps is highly dangerous. It adds danger to the already dangerous disease. So I believe that it's more important than ever that we don't allow political pressure or public frenzy to justify shortcutting of sound science and medical principles of efficacy and safety. And I know that there's a lot of pressure on the FDA to to reevaluate their normally very high standards, and I applaud them for trying to stick to their guns and maintain those standards while in this emergent situation. And they're always also in the untenable position of trying to evaluate the unevaluable, which is, what is the risk? And I'm a cancer expert, so I spend most of my time thinking about this. When the disease is more threatening than the possibility of using a test that has its own risks, what is the relative harm to benefit ratio of those two things? But the wrong test and the wrong treatment can kill you just as fast as the disease.
Thank you. And I am going to resist jumping in as an ethicist because I'm the moderator today. I'm going to turn that over to Jonathan. And in the process, let me say, I'm feeling some emotion about the passion and the time and the urgency of this conversation. And I want to say I'm so grateful for all of you joining us. And Carolyn, you're on the front line and you've taken the time away from that. And I'm wanting to double that expression in your willingness to do this without diluting my gratitude to all of you. And on that, okay, Jonathan, say what I was going to say or what you'd like to say.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Dr. Byrne and the OEC and ASE and API for supporting this panel. And thanks to you all for bringing perspectives on this really important topic. I bring a different perspective. I'm an academic philosopher by training. I'm an ethicist. I'm not boots on the ground in COVID-19. I'm in a position of privilege where I get to sit safely in my home and think about these things. And as I was thinking about the response to this panel, I went the route of the philosopher. So I wanted to share with you 3 premises that we all could think about together. The first of those, the first thing that came to my mind was that rules aren't sacred, values are. This is my first claim. The normative theories of philosophy or the normative ethics that I was trained in, they don't offer sort of unyielding sacred rules for action. And compliance rules aren't ethical rules, they're not the same thing. And so what we do is we work together through normative theories to define and give us structures to reason about our values, about what matters to us morally. And I think this point is exemplified by codes of ethics, like Angela was saying. The ABET Code of Ethics focuses on broad categories like human welfare and the public and the profession. And the values that are encoded in that code of ethics, along with IEEE and NSPE, are again important, but need work, including safety and health and welfare and honesty, all of which have this slipperiness to them. So I think that while rules change, the values that those rules encode remain consistent. And this maybe is evidenced in the shift towards ethical pluralism, right? It's not like, with the exception of some very few philosophers on the fringe, there aren't utilitarians arguing what we should do about COVID-19. Public health professionals are using a pluralistic approach to help us think about this. So again, rules aren't sacred, but values are. That's my first little premise. The second one, the one that's very important to me, is that ethics is a form of literacy. I hear again and again from professors and practitioners and administrators that, yeah, ethics is important, but we've got it covered. You know, whether it's a session of senior seminar or a modular online course or a couple of workshops or even occasional mentoring in labs. But if this pandemic and contemporary moment changes anything, I hope it's the recognition that ethics is a lot like engineering. You can learn the basics, so formulas and definitions and disaster cases in the classroom, but ethics is a sort of thing that requires ongoing engagement and experience. We become literate in ethics over time and with active engagement. And I think we've got plenty of evidence of how important and right that premise is. And the third one, if I may, to just go a little bigger picture and more abstract, is that interconnection is not interdependence. I think engineers in both their design theory and in their ethics recognize how interconnected they are in their work. Carolyn, you were mentioning you work with engineers and medical practitioners and policymakers, and the engineers work in these rich interdisciplinary teams, so they recognize the interconnection of their work. But I think, and also with their stakeholders, right? This is the user-centered design approach. But the idea that their orientation in the world is interdependent on those relationships, I think, is undervalued. And the distinction is really important to me as a philosopher in my own work, but I think it's really relevant here too. the shape of the world in which engineers work changes, even if that change is slow, as conditions around them change. It's not as if there's like engineering in all capital letters and that's then applied to different contexts over and over. Engineering itself changes as the conditions around it change. And the COVID-19 pandemic conditions have forced this experience on us directly. So I think we've got evidence and experience here in our lives that interconnection is not interdependence. Now, if I had been more careful, these premises would have built to some conclusion that would have made logical sense. But if I could draw anything away from them, it seems to me that what I'd like to see engineers be after is not a deviation from norms, but an expansion of our circle of moral concern. Engineers' norms have to expand. Maybe it's following some paradigm like the One Health paradigm in public health. And I think we've got some examples of this. So just to offer one, and accidentally, Roz, as a precursor to a panel next week, Art Kaplan, bioethicist Art Kaplan, a week and a half ago now, in the journal Vaccine, he and a co-author called for direct testing on human subjects for COVID-19 vaccines. And this represents a huge normative shift in the way that we've developed biotechnologies that have required, coming out of the atrocities of World War II, the requirement by the FDA, non-human animal testing first. And Kaplan argues in this piece that there's a reason why we should give up that model and shift to direct human testing. And again, I think the reason for that is because the pandemic conditions have thrust on us this idea that we are interdependent with the world around us. And there's some rich, I think, ethical implications to talk through about those things. I feel like I could go on at length, but I want to stop there and thank everybody again. I look forward to the conversation.
So before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that, yes, we see that the questions are building. There are actually 3 questions from Ayush Gupta and 1 from Stephanie Bird, and we will get to them. But before that, I'd like to just give panelists a chance. Is there anything you heard from one another that you'd like to clarify or respond to, comment on before we open it up to those who are our guests?
Yeah, something that Jonathan said really struck home to me because I'm a trialist and I've been doing clinical trials in cancer for decades. And I know that if you're going to use human beings as your experimental animal of choice, there are it's a very high bar, and there are whole structures that we've built around being able to do that, but we require by law that be preceded, and in fact, it's not very successful. So it's got a very high failure rate. And a part of the reason that the failure rate is so high is that we believe our own data from preclinical studies. We rely on the responses of animals, for example, to give us insight into the efficacy of a new drug or the safety of a new drug. And we know now from long experience, very sad experience, that those animal models are not very reliable. In fact, they are very misleading most of the time. And if there were an ethical way that we could skip over that step, which is very expensive and time consuming, and go directly to human beings, this is what we want to do, is that we help our patients. That's a subject I would love to see the ethicists weigh in on very heavily. And it seems that the pressure to do so, to evaluate that ethical issue of going straight to humans for testing, even though there are risks involved, is one we're going to have to grapple with when the urgency is great enough.
And indeed, this is the precise subject of the next in the series, which is Wednesday, next Wednesday, when Art Kaplan and others who are in the heart of it will be discussing this.
Oh,
and it's interesting, it's coming up now because indeed, it's critical and it's pressing, yes. In fact, there's a question in the queue pertaining to disparities in race with COVID, and that is the subject of our 3rd panel. And that panel has quite some remarkable people who will be having that conversation. We will not put it off from today's Q&A, but I do want listeners to know we're getting there. Today is a larger umbrella on questions of research and development, responsibilities of engineers, systems questions, but we can't avoid talking about the things that are coming because they're right there. They're right there.
Yeah, it's really hard, especially in this moment, to avoid any of those ideas too. You can't really talk about engineering ethics in this moment without talking about environmental justice and social justice and non-human animal welfare. I mean, these things are all bound up together. And I think I really am starting to feel quite passionately that this idea that engineers must have a sense of responsibility to all of those things if they have a responsibility to the public. This is the idea of interdependence, right? You can't just focus on the public defined narrowly as the stakeholders for an engineering experiment, because the work you do in the world has a direct impact on the world and all of these ethical concerns.
Keyword being experiment, perhaps?
Sorry, say it again, Rose?
Keyword being experiment, perhaps?
Perhaps, that's right.
Yeah. Angela, how does care come to play for us now? Is there room for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that has to be at the root, in my opinion. It's simply, again, that people don't really have consensus on what that looks like. But yeah, to me, that's why I sort of gravitated to that from my my own ethics training as an engineer over 25 years ago, which was almost zero formally, was very benefit analysis. And my father worked at the Department of Transportation in Iowa for an over 40-year career. So decisions about lane widths and guardrails and all sorts of safety in regards to our transportation infrastructure were literally cost-benefit analysis. They were this much money a human life is worth, an injury is worth this much, and we know how that went awry if we look at history in the Ford Pinto experience. So growing up with that, I felt like there was definitely problems using that as your ethical framework, and moving to care, I think also translates it down to a personal level, because I think in some respects for engineers, it's easier to not think about these things if they're down in a technical, like, the circuit. And then if it's generalized to some public, which seems very impersonal, that's going to do something different than like a medical person sees a patient, you see a face, you see an individual and know their story and know what they're confronting. But engineers often don't think in those kinds of individual and personal sorts of lenses. And I think that's to our detriment.
I actually think that that's a strength of yours. I love engineers. And the reason is that they think in this way. They're problem solvers. And if you show them a problem, immediately the response is, let's go solve it. So they're focused on problem solving more than they are the fallout and consequences of what might happen if they do solve that problem, or what might happen even on the way to solving the problem. But they're so powerful in terms of that problem solving ethos that they're almost unique in medicine, because in medicine you're always talking about fallout and why it might not work and why you shouldn't or should do it, and that's what you do on rounds, for example. It's all of this discussion about the possibilities, the differential diagnosis, etc. When engineers are very much more linear, and that is a huge benefit in medicine.
Like getting test kits designed really quickly, for example. What do you think, Stephen? Does that characterize you as an engineer? And what does that mean for this urgency we're in right now?
I feel very valued by the conversation. But I have to admit, I'm thinking of maybe a slightly more cynical and different approach, which I was going to bring to the group. Engineers are driven to solve problems. And like we think about the testing, one problem could be, I want to be first to market, right? I want to capture a financial interest, right? And so many of the challenges that I think we need to confront, especially around some of the emerging issues, is why do we want speed? So obviously we want speed to help patients. We want speed to help the society, but we might also want speed to be first to market and make money. And that's not to say that the third reason is a bad reason, but it is a reason, and sometimes it cuts against the other two. And so I think part of the challenge that we have in the need for speed is, when are we justifying our changing in processes in order to try to help patients? And when are we doing it to try to be first to market? And obviously they don't always have to be mutually exclusive, but I'll just say, I'm not a medical doctor, but I co-chaired the Rapid Response Committee for Michigan between engineering and medicine when the COVID crisis hit here in Ann Arbor in the Michigan area. And as you might know, there was we were pretty hard hit in Michigan, not as bad as New York City, but relatively speaking, we got it pretty bad. We were setting up a tent hospital on our athletic campus, for instance. Fortunately, we managed to go. And what I found was there were many, many, many folks who had their solution that they wanted to use to help people. But oftentimes it was driven by being first to market. I'd like to try this new thing, and and so obviously we can't do anything without FDA approval. There's, as you know, Carolyn, there's all these things. But what you find is there's this tension between I'm trying to make a business and I'm also trying to help. And if you talk to the business people, they see those things as being strongly aligned. What I wanted to bring to the conversation was they may not always be. And so I think that when someone comes forward to say, I need to change well thought through ethical processes or compliance processes because I'm trying to save a life, that I want to make sure that argument does not trump all the other issues that come forward. So I hope that's not too cynical for our conversation, but it's something that we grappled with quite a bit because we had all kinds of stakeholders coming forward, both from within our own community and outside, with very thoughtful but ad hoc solutions they wanted to try on patients, and it took a long time to say, no, you can't do that. This is not a time to experiment. Carolyn, you know what I'm talking about?
I amen, Stephen. I know too many examples where this is not to say that pharmaceutical companies and other device and drug developers, be that whether the device is a diagnostic or other device that helps patients, shouldn't have an economic incentive to do what they do. If they didn't, we wouldn't get any new drugs. So that has to be in place. But on the other hand, we've seen too many examples like Myriad, where they patent a gene and then they have a test for a BRCA1 mutation that is so valuable to women because of breast cancer is also a pandemic. And you couldn't get that test without paying thousands of dollars. That was just unethical. Or the developers would use a cohort of patients who had a rather rare disease to develop a drug. And then when they put it on the market, it was so expensive that the very people with the disease couldn't afford to get it. So there's something wrong with this picture, and we need to be able to come to a balanced answer, and we are not there by a long shot.
Here's an example in the current crisis, the one that's the coronavirus crisis. My understanding is there was a rush to market for antibody testing. And now there's a flush of antibody testing and ads for them, and some of them have false positives and are not very reliable. And so was that a misbalance of getting to market first and helping people? And does care come in there somewhere?
In fact, that's one of the examples I was going to posit if it hadn't been brought up, which is an example of, under the guise, candidly, of moving forward with the need to fulfill the need for testing. A great many of these tests came forward that are worse than useless. They're detrimental, and so that, to me, I think, is one pole of this argument that is like, that is not why we want to rush FDA testing. But like anything, you can imagine a spectrum of such, we can come up with hypothetical circumstances anywhere between. But I think that's the root of it, because what we're also finding it's not just in terms of medicine, but here's another example that I'm actually grappling with in the meeting before this meeting. We would like to do contact tracing when the students potentially come back to fall. So Michigan, and I think a lot of our universities are thinking about how we want to do the fall semester. Well, one way is to have your phone monitor when you're on campus. You ping into the servers, into the wireless, and essentially you can monitor anybody on campus if their phone is on, right? Now, I don't think our students would like to be monitored passively all the time while they're on campus. And don't get me started on the facial recognition and temperature measurement solution either. There might be some problems with that too, right? So you have a technical solution that could solve the contact tracing problem, but it's probably not an ethical solution or even a desirable solution, because then people might even resist it. They don't want to do it. So that's today's Steve's ethical conundrum before the next one, right? But I think that's the kind of thing COVID is doing. It's like we're rushing to make a solution. Amazon has an app. You put it on your phone. It tells you when you're 6 feet apart. Yay, we've solved the problem. It's like, nope, you really haven't solved the problem.
Yeah, Stephen, one of the things I've been advocating in my own writing has been the problem of speed in technological development more generally. I think it's not as if this moment is changing the things we value. It's changing about how quickly we can think about them. There's a disconnect for me between the time it takes to think through a complex ethical issue and the speed at which deliverables have to be offered up, or even under which conditions change. And that disconnect is something that I just can't reconcile. I can't figure out a way in which we can think ethically faster. I mean, that's the response.
Yeah. And if we don't actually have these candid conversations in the academy, with not just between professors and folks, but with our students and the community that is part of our towns and stuff, then it's hard to even imagine it going further. And so one of the challenges that we're having in Ann Arbor is having the students come back as an impact to the town, right? So we think about it as an impact to our campus and what we do, but there's a lot of people that live here and they will be impacted if a bunch of students come back. So a lot of our planning goes into talking to the stakeholders in the town, which we all do. I mean, this is not anything. But you're right, the speed with which this is coming is incredible. And so the tendency then is to cut corners, right? Or we need a solution today. We'd like to try to not do that.
We have much more to say. Please, Carolyn, please.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to respond to Stephen's thing. If we do, and we do turn out bad tests faster, we're only shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of the other efforts that we're trying to put forward to contain the pandemic. For example, if you have a viral test with a bad negative predictive value, in other words, you can't rely on a negative test as being true. You will give that test result to a person and they will think, oh, great, I'm not infected, and go forward doing whatever they're doing. And you won't know that they need to be contact traced if it's a false negative. So there's all kinds of ramifications of giving someone fake news in terms of their test result. And if it's an antibody test, you get another set of problems. If you give them back a false positive result and you say, yes, you have antibodies to this virus, and they think, great, I'm immune, and they go on their merry way, then you're complicating the problem again, but in another fashion. So of course, I'm highly biased, and I admit that up front, but I think that the validity of test results is really important here, and we therefore can't afford to be flooding the market, so to speak, with bad tests that are generating bad results that are going to have bad ramifications for the population, as well as the patient, him or herself.
And there's also an equity issue, I'd add in that.
Oh, yeah.
We have a discussion here. Our student athletes are coming back to campus and they're all being tested, which is fine. is a good thing, right? But that said, then there are other stakeholders that be, well, is there a preferential reason why athletes get tested, but not folks that are coming from parts of southeastern Michigan with more prevalence of COVID? Excuse me. So the answer, obviously the preferred answer is we have lots of tests for everybody, but that's not the answer. So even just the whole, who gets a test? Why are they getting a test? This is a challenge too. Now, ideally, this will solve a little bit as we get more testing capacity. But I think we all understand that just like N95 masks, by the time they've solved that problem, that's gone on to the next problem, swabs or with the next thing. So by the time we do the testing problem, it'll be the next thing. So engineers have to get to work. We'll work harder.
I think one of the questions I'll put to the group, and then we're going to transition to the Q&A in a few minutes, but you say engineers have to get to work. Do you get to work with a clarity of sense of values, as Jonathan is suggesting? Do you get to work with a clarity of what the ethics, the deontology is, or the rules that we want to follow? How do you get to, or you get to work just because you fix the problem, you fix it. So how do you get to work in light of ethics?
Well, actually riffing on what Carolyn mentioned is that many engineers are very linear. They're sort of like, I hesitate to use this analogy with professional philosophers, but they truly are the hedgehogs of us, right? So they just sort of look burrowing in. And so if you say, go after the, we do that. And so the best collaborations I've had in this sort of sphere have been with medical professionals, public health professionals, where there's a spectrum of people, right? But in reality, to some extent, engineers respond to the stimulus that we receive from society, from NSF, they make priorities, or foundations, you know. So a lot of times we're a trailing indicator of what society wants us to do, whether that's business or government. I'd love to tell you that we lead there, but we really, you know, basically society decides that they want to do something, and then we respond to that urge to some extent. Okay. Having said that, I think the best thing to do is have conversations like this to help us decide where our priorities should be. Where should we make our investments, right? And hopefully we'll be in a situation in a little while where we have that conversation in a real way. But the best way to keep an engineer honest is to surround them with a bunch of non-engineers.
And not to put Angela on the spot, but I'm thinking now, Angela, of the recent NSF project you just finished up, looking at quantifying the ways in which engineering students have been taught ethics. And I'd be interested to know, from your perspective, are our engineers being trained to like work with other people, as Steve's pointing out, or is something else happening? Because it does seem like I've got the same sense of engineers as hedgehogs. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a broad spectrum, so it can't really be generalized. I mean, we have lots of examples of humanitarian engineering programs, for example, that really do engage deeply in these issues. And we're very much thinking about this even before COVID, about caring for others, about using their skills. I mean, we had a student right away, they were kicked off campus, but she wanted to make PPE. She wanted to make face shields using the 3D printers that she knew that we had in our facilities. And so some students are thinking of this right away. I mean, that's why they came to engineering. They were sold on engineers help society, and that's why they came. So it's kind of an old school throwback to characterize engineers as hedgehogs. I think there are still some like that. That tends to be more on the faculty side than the student side. A lot of our students are very excited to not be constrained to only the technical piece. But we as faculty, if we don't have that training or that mindset from our own backgrounds, we might not be prepared to facilitate that. So it's been actually very interesting to contrast some of the faculty who are teaching engineering now. For example, like they were in Engineers Without Borders as students, and now they're faculty. So they're bringing this richer ethical, social context that they experienced as students, you know, post ABET EC 2000. You can critique it as being sort of limited, but it's better than what we had. And so I think we're on very much an increasing trajectory of, you know, recognizing our limitations, but not always just relying on someone else to tell us. You know, having worked across disciplines, develop language so that we can communicate more clearly. I think that value, I feel like more of our students are coming away with that.
And I'll second that, Angela. I think that many of the younger folks going into engineering, they're doing it. Many have a mission in mind. They really want to, they want to serve society. I'll agree to say that most faculty, or the faculty promotion process sort of is a hedgehog filter to some extent, I'd add. But with that said, and this is probably another panel that can be formed, is there's the question of whether your education at a university is to get a job or to learn things about life. And so we always have this debate of, you know, we just finished our executive panel in our college. So I was sitting with all the great and the good who serve on our advisory board, right? And these are generally titans of industry. And a lot of times you get into these discussions about, well, you need to train the students this way. And I think that maybe the conversation we're having is that, no, we have to educate the students. You know, there's not just training, it's talking and learning and thinking about things like ethics and how to interact with society. So we try to do that sometimes too.
I think we should, I'm sorry, Carolyn, to cut you off. There is this feeling of a pressure cooker in the Q&A and in the chat at this point that I think needs to be released just a little bit before we continue. Ayush Gupta, we're going to take you off of mute. You have lots of comments and a few questions. If you can focus on one in particular now, and that way we can make sure everyone who has a question hopefully gets answered. So please, I'm going to take you off of mute.
Hello.
Here we go. Hi, welcome.
Hi. My question, okay, I'll center it down to one question, and that is related to the COVID, which is that clearly the system was broken because the testing didn't happen on time. If a researcher did not break rules, then we wouldn't even know about the Seattle spread. Literally, right? That's the history of this event. And then what transpired was medical rules, which actually discriminate against Black and Indigenous people of color, especially, and people of color more broadly, right? So I don't understand, when the system is broken, how is it that the message that we are hearing is our ethical standards are all fine, we just have to adhere to them really strongly, and just a little bit tinkering around the edges, and just we just need to teach people those same things, and then it'll, like, how is the ways in which we have weighed ethics in our community, in our field, not fundamentally broken and in need of revision in the face of what we are looking? How can we absolve that? And I'm sitting with this irony. I'm sitting with the irony that our campuses are going to emerge more white, more male. And somehow we are saying that that the young people are fine. We are doing everything great, right? It's only some of the older faculty maybe. I am sitting with this irony, both at the campus level and at the COVID level, that we are not fundamentally questioning how our disciplinary ethics are framed and understood. That's all.
That's all. Thank you. That's rich and important. Thank you. Everybody's head is nodding. Carolyn, Jonathan, who would like to start with this?
I could start because I mentioned I wrote a short thing to Ayush in the chat window just a second ago, but it's easy to talk ourselves up, I think, from positions of privilege like each of the panelists are. But I think you're right, Ayush, to push us. And I think that's what I was trying to get at with my first premise, if you'll recall, that rules aren't sacred, right? The idea that we've figured it out and like all we have to do is whatever, have our students take a course or indoctrinate them into this way of thinking about ethics and everything will be fine. I mean, that's not true. And the pandemic conditions have made that explicit. And I don't think really engineers have ever thought that was true. There's a little bit of hedgehogging, maybe. Like in our professional training, we become specialists and it's really hard to find the breadth. It's a struggle I have day to day thinking about engineering ethics education. Like, where do we fit that into a curriculum, which is so technical? But again, I think the answer to your concerns, as naive as it may sound, is like we have to give engineers the space, the mental and the physical space to engage these questions directly, right? And I know that's not a satisfying answer, especially right now. And I don't know that I've got a better answer for you, but I just feel really strongly that it's about having space for these conversations. And at least in my limited experience, my engineering students at the undergraduate and graduate levels don't have curricular space, and their faculty don't have expertise to lead those discussions. And the work falls on the occasional rogue ethicist who shows up and is like, hey, we ought to be right. And then they're like, no, we don't have space for that. Like give a seminar, you know. It's a point of frustration for me too. And I worry that you, Ayush, will see this as sort of pandering to your important questions. And I hope that my colleagues can help me make it clear that we're not. We take your concerns really seriously.
I would say it's a very slow process. So if I were to think specifically at the Code of Ethics of the American Society of Civil Engineers that I quoted, because that's my background, it wasn't until 2017 that we added an 8th canon that explicitly says treat all persons fairly. And some of the other societies were ahead of us. So I believe that there were, you know, equity statements in IEEE, for example, before us, but largely perhaps driven because they have more international engagement and ASCE is more US centric. But I guess that's why I think both our COVID situation, excuse me, and our current situation maybe draw some attention, where before it's been kind of running under the radar, assuming that everything's okay, and it's not okay. But people were reasonably unaware of that. And now we're really going to have our attention focused on why should we think about this? Is it really relevant to bring up some of these ideas and uncover problems that have been there, but largely unrecognized? Our study, for example, I mean, and I think I saw it in the chat window, this term about microethics versus macroethics going by, and some faculty and programs are, for example, you know, drawing to the macroethical level. So it's not just your responsibility to your employer to make money, to be first to market, but bring in some of this richness around, think about social justice, think about global sustainability challenges. And engineers should be thinking of that from the very beginning. If we frame our problems too narrow, and I think Carolyn brought up, we solve problems, but if we define the problem, then we've left out all of these important considerations. And so then it seems ridiculously easy in a way. I mean, to me, the difficult piece is merging the technical, I'm a civil engineer, so the natural unknowns, but then bring in the social, and it's a wicked problem. I mean, it definitely is. So,
May I add one more thing? I think this is related, or at least helps me focus on the question a little differently. The question I think, Roz, you posed to the panel, one of the questions was, what are the questions of ethics that arise when we change the rules in a crisis? And so I had to do a little sleuthing, but it looks like back a few years after Hurricane Katrina in 2009, the National Academies released a joint letter outlining crisis response guidelines. And they list their value priorities. And I think it's really interesting because these are the sort of value priorities that seem to apply all of the time. And what I might do is just put these in the window so that we can all, in the chat window, so we can all see them. But there's a list here. This is from page here, and I'll do this too, sorry.
Do you want a screen share capacity, or do you want to do it in the chat?
I'll just do it in the chat. I think nobody needs to see my terrible notes. Okay. There's a link to the letter from 2009, but again, on page, this is 29 to 33 if you want a page reference, but the duties I list here are the duties described as the duties or the values that are important during a crisis. And Ayush, this is indirectly a question to you in response, but like, why aren't these seem to be the values that engineers would share all of the time, right? And so my question is, like, what do conditions of conflict or conditions of a pandemic say do to this set of values? And the answer, I think, is the answer from bioethics, right? It's just that we have to work to specify and balance them differently than we do in non-pandemic conditions. But to Ayush's point, I think we've done that badly, right? That they need to be specified and balanced with more intentionality in better dialogue with everyone. And again, that's the work of ethics, as I see it.
Jonathan, we've done this badly, not just relative to the COVID pandemic, but to the social pandemic that we're undergoing right now. That's amplifying this. So this needs to be, and I think people have talked about this, that all the interconnectedness of all of these things. It's the way we think, and it's what we prioritize, and that has to be kept up front under all circumstances, whether it's urgent or not. There are just certain ethical standards, and we don't really we've never, as a society, come to a conclusion about, or an agreement about, a universal ethical standard that just would apply across the board in all situations. That's our lifeline to ethical behavior for human beings. We have those things defined in certain settings, but they don't, but it's like a Venn diagram, and all parts of those bubbles don't always overlap. And I think we're going to have to be thinking about wholeness here in a much more serious fashion, inclusively, to include all of our people, all of our populations, all of our patients, and all of the settings in which this is occurring. It's not going to change unless we change it.
If I can just add, Karen, what you said got me thinking. I mean, I completely agree, but I think about the justification given to bioethical principlism, right? That it is universal and applies in all conditions. The problem is there's this important caveat that those are guidelines, not maxims. And so to figure out how beneficence applies requires our constant engagement with it, how we specify it, how we balance it vis-a-vis other concerns like justice. And again, that work is not work we prioritize space for. And we must, if we're going to take seriously social justice issues or pandemic conditions, those are things we really have to take seriously. And I don't know, I'm hobby horsing it now, sorry, but I feel very passionately about it. And the last thing you said, which
I'm not even an ethicist, so I.
No, and I barely am. I pretend.
Becky Bates put in the chat earlier something about sitting in the discomfort of that, and perhaps of everything we're talking about, right? Allowing ourselves right in this moment to sit in the discomfort. And I just asked, why are we talking about this in this way on Juneteenth? What do you mean by that? It's a day to celebrate, is it not?
I think I'm just sitting with the tension that the response that I still got was that our underlying value system is fine. And the way it is written out is in some ways reflective of the way it is practiced. Because I keep on hearing in response that, see, these are the standards, right? They look fine. But they look nothing like if we look at engineering as social practice. And this constant thing about like that we have to do for everybody. I can't believe but sit on this like the zeitgeist of this moment, and I can't sit and believe that I'm hearing that when I explicitly asked about trying to think about the racial factors and the inequities, the response I'm getting is that we have to do everything in a universal way for all, and that there's a way we can do that like it's unbelievable. I'm just sitting with this irony here, and today of all days. I want everybody to sit with that tension now.
So I just want to be clear that what I was saying was that everything is not fine, but everything is not in a shambles either. We do think ethically about certain parts of our life, but we've never, as a community of humans, ever come to a place where all of our circles of activity intersect, and where we can grab a hold of the common themes that we all agree are, it's like the Constitution, it's writing down the principles that are our goals and working toward those. things are not fine now. But we have a vision of that's what we need to work toward, is that vision that's comprehensive. It can't just work in one little segment and be ignored in another. It will never come together.
May I suggest that we sit with the tension Ayush has brought to the conversation and open for Ivan to make the comment that she would like to make. Ivan? Michael, can you help Ivan come off mute, please?
Thank you all. Yes, I would like to thank to all of you for this session, for make this session available. A lot of things in my mind to think. So my first question will be, or my kindly request will be, I would love to be able to use this recording with my students. So please, Rosalind, let us know how we will get it. And the comment, which actually is not a question, eventually we will get a vaccine, but I mean, I am professor here in South America. I don't know yet what the cost of that vaccine will be. I mean, it will be again another scenario when someone is going to be filter rich, and a lot of people will be in a bad shape. Thank you all.
Actually, the vaccine issue brings up another big ethical question, I think, and that is the ability of people to have choice about whether or not they or their children will be vaccinated, and the scientific knowledge that we need herd immunity. Those are in conflict, and we're seeing that more and more in diseases like measles, which are having breakouts because people are refusing to be vaccinated or have their children vaccinated. I think this is an ethical thing. Do you allow people that choice when it harms the community? Which is the greater need or greater weight for the ethical issue?
And I heard embedded in Ivan's question a concern about justice too, right? That there's questions of access, so distribution of resources, and and that's in conflict with the duty to care. How do we resolve those, especially in a pandemic situation?
Right. One way of thinking is Ivan suggested that folks could not afford a vaccine, right?
Yes.
Should people pay for the vaccine? Should that be provided to people independent of their ability or willingness to pay? So you'd like to think that if society invested the resources to create one or more vaccines that are effective, that they would not be limited to the distribution due to people's ability to pay.
But then they have to take the vaccine.
They have to take it as well. Right. And so to me, the question also becomes, should we be in a situation where if people are willing to take it, they cannot have access to it because they can't afford it? That to me seems unethical.
Agreed.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. You're so kind.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Ivan. Gupta, you had your hand up. Did you have a question to add to that, or? I don't see it anymore. No. Okay. All right. Thank you. Ayush, thank you. Let's move on. Let's see. There was an earlier question from Ilana. Do you still have a question you'd like to pose? Ilana Kepton?
Ilana, you can unmute yourself.
I just did that. Okay, so again, thank you all for having me. I'm not from United States. You can hear it from my accent. I want to go back to the basic questions of the interclash between engineers and ethicists. And I come from an engineering school. And I agree with Jonathan that ethics is literacy, and it's something that keeps evolving and changing. Though we all keep our values, as Stephen already showed us, I mean, people come into the discussion with their values, and we share values. But the language of ethics and the listening to the different sounds of it is what the ethicist, or at least the practical ethicist, will do. Now, engineering is also a literacy. In every subsection of engineering and technology, people get a special language. So at the end of the day, what I think is needed, or I actually asking you what is needed, is the connection between those two disciplines as they develop and think about their product. So are we at the time where actually during the process of developing a technology or a technological innovative artifact, we should have the connection with ethicists? And if we do, and if you think this is possible, do you think it's time for ethicists to be, and I hope this is going to be recorded but kind of classified, should ethicists be accountable for the success and maybe the fallouts and the risks that the product they were actually advising for? I'm even scared of saying it out loud, actually at the outcomes of the product that they, and we're kind of grappling with the idea in our school. So I would like to hear what you think about it. Thank you.
I'll start if that's okay. I think about this too a lot, Ilana. And I think we've got a pretty good model in medicine already of the role of the ethicist. And the model there, or at least the implicit premise of that model, is that medical practitioners, like practicing physicians, don't have the professional space, or they're so specialized, they don't have the time or resources to do the ethics work all on their own. And so they have around them a team of ethicists or an ethics board on which they can rely.
I agree.
Now, there might be a disconnect, Ilana, and my colleagues can speak to it, between medicine and engineering more strongly than I think there is. But I think as engineers continue to be more and more specialized in their work too, that the equivalent structure, having an ethics board or an ethicist on staff, is going to become more and more prevalent. It'll be more and more common. And then to your second question about the ethicist's responsibility, again, I think medicine has a pretty good model there, where the responsibility still lies in the hands of the physician, hence the insurance risks and all those things. And precisely because the ethicist doesn't tell them what decision they should make. They tell them about the range of options and the possible implications of the decisions they might make. They help think about value conflicts and stakeholders and all of those questions, hence our broader, higher order thinking. And then we let the physician and the engineer make that decision because they're the technician. They're hands-on. So I think the model could be replicated, and in some ways I think it already is.
Jonathan, thank you. Lana, thank you. What I'm going to do now, because I'm looking at it being nine after the hour, I'm going to see if we can get, there are two people who have been in the queue for a while who we have not yet acknowledged. Let's see if we can get quick answers and then have just a couple minutes for closing statements. And so if you can come on in, Chrysula Gitsoulis, if you're still there.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to read my question in case the panelists and whoever is attending did not get a chance to see it. It's about 2 minutes ago, 3 minutes ago that I posted this. So I'm wondering, what determines a standard of care for COVID? South Korea has been using hydroxychloroquine. This is probably a drug that all of you have heard of, plus Z-Pak as the standard of care since March, and they credit their low death rate to that. And similarly for other countries, Turkey, Costa Rica, Honduras, among them. And they base this determination on numerous observational studies. that have demonstrated success with use of this treatment. Yet here we haven't advanced this as a standard of care. And this may be why we have a higher death rate here than in these other countries. In cases of emergency, like this COVID situation, shouldn't numerous observational studies supporting a given treatment be given more weight than in non-emergency situations in determining the standard of care? That was my question. So I realized that in non-emergency situations, it may be right, the right thing to do to aim for a higher standard, what we may call, the gold standard in determining what a standard of care should be, a double-blind, controlled experiment. But we have yet to conduct this kind of an experiment involving the hydroxychloroquine plus Z-Pak at the early stages where one gets acquires the COVID. So given that we have yet to get any results on this, and given also that we've been getting in the observational studies, high success, in many of the observational studies, reports of high success rates, then why aren't we letting that have more weight in determining what a standard of care should be?
Who among our panelists feels prepared to answer this question at this time? It's densely packed.
I know from my medical training that observational studies are often overturned with rigorous scientific prospectively designed studies with the appropriate controls. And I think that that's what we're suffering from right now. And I think that there have been trials done, and the FDA has just pulled those drugs or removed the guidance for using those drugs for COVID. And one of the studies showed that not only did COVID patients who were already symptomatic and severely symptomatic not benefit from the drug, they actually had a worse outcome. And the drug also has cardiovascular toxicities. So all of this together makes it, and we've recently found that a very cheap drug, dexamethasone, that affects the immune system, modulates the immune system, is effective in severely symptomatic patients. And I'm not saying that doesn't have toxicities either, but it's the way that the studies are done. It's the weight of the evidence weighed against standards of good science that determines standards of care. I'm not in the position of being able to answer. I haven't reviewed all the studies, but I look at the evidence that comes forward on a daily basis, and the weight of evidence that this is beneficial, and I guess it's also dependent on what stage of the disease you're using it. It determines the way the medical community receives that information and is willing to act on it.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Priscilla. Stephanie, we have barely a minute. Is there something you'd like to ask very quickly or say before we close and thank our panelists? And sorry to cut you off, Carolyn. I'm sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I think that all of this really highlights the importance of communication across disciplines, which is extremely difficult. And I think that's one of the real values of these panels, but it really highlights the difficulty in terms of, for example, just the term standard of care. That's really a hard-won notion that we haven't gotten to yet. It really requires a lot of very careful studies, for example. And I think that, Jonathan's very early point about literacy, ethics being a matter of literacy, is really highlighted by this panel also. It's just hard work. I think Becky made the point. It takes a lot of time and effort and you all have made the point about just really thinking carefully about working these issues into practice. So I think that that's one of the take-home messages of the panel, I think, and of the state of the situation we're in, of the importance of communication being a dynamic two-way thing, and it's something that everybody has to work on from both sides in order to really bridge the communication gaps in terms of making real the ethical values that we have, both in terms of what they are and how we can implement them in the choices that we make as professionals in all of our things. So that was my take-home way from this session overall.
And it's a beautiful way to close. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And there is no actual closure to this. This is the beginning of a series of very difficult and very important conversations. I want to thank the panelists for helping us to launch this series. I want to encourage those who attended to come to the next and see if we can make any progress as we continue to sort out what it is we believe, what it is we value, what it is we need to be doing right now for all of us. And so again, thank you so much, and take good care. Please, all of us, take good care.
Thank you, Russ. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hear, hear.